Big round of applause and a shout out to our musicians, James Zito and Nicole Ojamong. They are currently students in the jazz program at Juilliard, just across the street. So great. So as you all know, tonight's talk is focused on the historic neighborhood of San Juan Hill, and this is the second event in our series of talks, focusing on that history. The whole series is part of a larger project called Legacies of San Juan Hill, and it is a collaboration with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And it is dedicated to exploring and uplifting the history and communities and cultural legacy of the Manhattan neighborhood called San Juan Hill, as per the name, which existed in and around the area where Living Center resides today, so in this neighborhood. Tonight, the conversation focuses on the Puerto Rican experience in San Juan Hill and the surrounding areas in the first half of the 20th century. And I'm so excited to, and I want to acknowledge it's co-presented by Centro, and we have some staff members from Centro here tonight, and we're very thankful for that. So thank you. And thank you. And as I mentioned again, our musicians will be playing again after the discussion, so feel free to stick around and hear them again after the talk. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to announce our moderator for the evening, an author and journalist who writes for The Nation, The New York Times, and CNN Opinions, as well as a lecturer at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Please welcome Ed Morales.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to call up our panel members now. You said that I was going to be on. Welcome everyone to Avery Fisher Hall / David Geffen Hall. And I'm really excited to be here tonight to moderate this panel about the history of Puerto Ricans and other Latinx people here, and African Americans and everyone else who lived in San Juan Hill and New York City. So first, let me ask the panelists to come up, and then I'll introduce you once you're seated. Okay, to my left here, everyone will of course recognize Aurora Flores Hostos, who she began her career as a musician, then became an incredible journalist about Latin music, creator of the 100 Years of Latin Music in New York podcast with co-host Anina Centeno. She actually needs no introduction, Aurora Flores.
Thank you.
Louder?
Yes, her name. Yeah.
Oh, Aurora Flores.
Thank you.
Or Aurora Flores, as we say. To my far right is Elena Martinez, whose work spans historical essays, documentaries, and exhibitions. Now, I saw From Mambo to Hip Hop, and I still teach it to my undergraduates at Columbia. It's a fantastic documentary. Everyone should see it. You have to pay for it, right? It's not free on YouTube?
It might be free on YouTube.
Oh, okay, well, try to pay for it somehow.
They're showing it at the Bronx Public Library next week, so.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Allerton NYPL, they're showing it, yeah.
What, dígalo en el micrófono?
Oh my God, that's
Yeah.
right. Sorry about that. NYPL, they're showing From Mambo to Hip Hop this weekend, I think, if anyone wants to see it. But I think it is on YouTube.
The greatest part is at the end when you, all right, I'm not going to go with you. And to my immediate right is Lauren Thomas, who's an associate professor of history at Rutgers University Camden, and the author of several books, including Puerto Rican Citizen History and Political Identity, 20th Century New York, and that's what we're going to be talking about a lot here with her colleague Aldo Lauria Santiago over there at Rutgers. And I'm really excited to hear Lauren's really well-developed ideas about the history of the communities here. So this is going to be a totally interesting evening. And we're going to talk about the presence of Puerto Ricans and other marginalized people here that unfortunately were displaced by the Lincoln Center project, and hopefully we can revive some of that history so that, because those people have really not gone away. We can feel them in our midst, and you know, they've influenced so much about what happened in New York, and it was a working class community. And there was just a lot of jazz and Latin music here. You know, of course, it could be disputed whether Latin music is a valid term, but we can also call it Afro-Caribbean music. So first of all, I'd like to ask Lauren, what was the historical context that allowed these cultures to all come together and create, you know, what I consider hybrid cultures of the United States that mixed many different influences to create products, cultural products that we know, we've heard of, you know, jazz, salsa music, boogaloo, mambo. What's that historical context?
Well, I'm going to leave it to my far more knowledgeable colleagues, Elena and Aurora, to talk about the culture part, the music part. I'll give a little bit of sense of the history, and there was indeed a very kind of hybrid political culture that laid the groundwork for the music and the art that came out of the community at various points in the early 20th century. So I want to, not to be too schematic about it, but the migration of Puerto Ricans to New York City happened in a few different phases. I mean, one of those phases was sort of, well, they're all sort of not very brief or specific, but they're somewhat distinct, so I think it's worth spelling out. And the earliest phase of Puerto Rican migration to New York, it probably happened much earlier than many people realize, late 19th century. The independentistas from Puerto Rico and Cuba who collaborated together, starting in the 1850s in their homelands, fought a 10-year war with Spain from the 1860s to 1870s, and then many of the kind of intellectual leaders of the independence movement after that war resettled in New York and kind of gathered forces and collaborated. As a couple of my colleagues here were chatting earlier about many aspects of this history, there was support from people in the United States who were interested in seeing Spain defeated. But what happened in New York was, by the 1890s in particular, as the second stage of the war that became the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898, in the planning for that, there was a tremendous, I mean, not massive, but a tremendous kind of political atmosphere of kind of working against colonialism. What were we saying?
Yes, there was an atmosphere of rebellion against colonialism.
Rebellion, and it was very intellectual. A number of the leaders of this movement in the 1890s were also poets and wrote, published their ideas widely. One fairly well-known kind of related member of this group was Arturo Schomburg. Many of you know at least something about him. And I learned recently from an excellent book about this period in New York City by my history colleague Jesse Hoffman-Garskoff, that Schomburg he lived in San Juan Hill as
130 West 62nd Street.
That was in the 1890s, right?
Yeah, in the 1890s.
And during the early decade of the 20th century, he was collaborating with a fellow journalist and celebrated this guy at the Hotel Maceo, which was on 53rd Street in San Juan, or like lower San Juan Hill.
Very
in
close,
any case,
yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot to know about this early period of the Puerto Rican migration. Not large in number. A significant second stage of migration happened around the time of World War I, that coincided or was partly motivated by the shift in citizenship status of Puerto Ricans when the United States, some people say, imposed U.S. citizenship on islanders, which it turns out would indeed tie the island to the United States in this colonial relationship pretty indelibly. But that produced a new wave of migration, and by the end of the 1920s, there were probably around 40,000 Puerto Ricans living in New York City. A lot of them settled in Harlem, in East Harlem, but there was a significant community in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. There was a core in the West Village, and then some early migrants to the neighborhood, to San Juan Hill. And then the major Puerto Rican migration that many people are more familiar with happened after World War II. And it was this period, the late 1940s, that drew a really sharply increasing number of Puerto Ricans to the San Juan Hill neighborhood. And that was significant because it kind of, the migrants in that period were vilified in the press. They were considered to be poor, illiterate, not bringing much of value to the city of New York. I mean, this is by a lot of white New Yorkers who were concerned about, I mean, sort of old anti-immigrant discourses arose again. They had been kind of quieted down after the 1920s. And so this was the context in which this neighborhood became a very significantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. There were roots of Puerto Rican culture, as Elena and Aurora will talk about, dating back to the early 20th century. But the number of Puerto Ricans in San Juan Hill spiked sharply in the early 1950s, and that was around the time that the Puerto Rican government established an office called the Migration Division Office, which was designed to help migrants find jobs, to direct them to services in the city, provide them with language training information, just a sort of general agency to sort of like the settlement houses of the early 20th century were for European immigrants. And that office was on 62nd Street. It had been established not long before the decision to dismantle the neighborhood and build Lincoln Center. So there's more I can say. I'm gonna let us shift gears. I do, like, at some point later I'll talk about the period from 1955 to 1960, which was such a crucial and very, like, a lot happened in that period in terms of Puerto Rican politics, labor politics, which was kind of long-standing, very interesting site of hybrid relationships, and some other kind of political issues that really brought the kind of the Puerto Rican community into the public eye in some both negative and positive ways in the late 1950s. But we'll get to that later. I'll pause for now.
Okay, so that's great because everyone should understand that the stereotype of Puerto Ricans is often tied to movies like West Side Story, which took place very close to here. And we don't think enough about the presence of Puerto Ricans and other people from the Caribbean who are living in the U.S. Just right after 1898, when the U.S. fought the war with Spain, which the Cubans consider the Cuban War of Independence. So I want Aurora now to tell us a little bit about, that the narrative arc of how music developed in a community like this, stemming from the days of Canario to the Palladium Mambo era and Boogaloo and beyond.
Well, that's a lot to cover.
Okay, well.
But let's see how we get there.
Yeah, I know that you've got so many stories and you can just,
Well, I can tell
everything
you
is going to be a gem.
that
Yeah.
the music,
Right.
politics led the way.
Yeah.
And when 1898 happened and the U.S. took over Puerto Rico and Guantanamo Bay and the Philippines and all of that, well, the musicians read the writing on the wall. One of the things especially in Cuba and Puerto Rico, you had schooled Afro-Cuban and Afro-Puerto Ricans, Afro-Boricuas in the military bands. And these marching bands that were almost in every pueblo, they got a monthly check. And because there was so much travel going through Cuba and through Puerto Rico, they learned all kinds of rhythms, from polkas, from waltzes, to danzas, to classical. And someone like Rafael Hernandez, his grandfather, great-grandfather, he made sure all the children knew music, because not only did they get a monthly check, they were able to buy houses. They were able to live well. When they knew that Spain was going to retire all those marching bands, and then the talking movies were happening, because one of the big jobs of musicians was to sit in the theaters and play. So now they knew that was going down. So they followed the poets, they followed the politicians, the musicians, they followed that here on. They started planting their flags. And here there was a lot of opportunity. Here they would see that, they came with someone like James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe was the man here in San Juan Hill. He was also a school musician, but he had a guild. He had a union. And back in like 1912, and he had the first, in 1912, in Carnegie Hall, he debuted 125 black musicians. And he would, yes, in Carnegie Hall back then, the American Federation of Musicians ignored him. So he advocated for black musicians to be in white bands and get paid. And when World War II came and he became a lieutenant, he went to Puerto Rico because he knew about the marching bands. And then meeting Rafael Hernandez must have been his dream, because he brought the other horn players. So there were like 18 horn players in his Harlem Hellfighters, touring Europe with big band and jazz, what they called jazz back then. So these brothers are doing it in Europe. They come back to New York. And New York, now you're in that period of time, 1920s. There are a lot of Latinos here already. There's Spanish exiles. There's Cubanos, Puerto Ricanos. And New York is the place to be, especially if you're an artist. So by 1920, in La Prensa, you have a full-page article about a young violinist from Spain named Javier Cugat, who comes to Carnegie Hall. So you have the beginnings of all this. And what you have there in terms of entertainment is a lot of the classical music going on. So what happens? When the Harlem Hellfighters come back, Rafael Hernandez comes back. By the next year, his family comes, his sister comes. Then he goes to Cuba. and he writes like Cachita, like a national anthem for Cuba. Then he goes to Santo Domingo and he writes Quiqueya. Then he goes to Mexico, and Mexico is just flexing its movie muscles. So there's actually footage of him conducting a big band. So he comes back with all this knowledge to New York, and what does he do? He rejects the Spanish classical music. He says, I'm going to record the music of the farmers, the music of the jibaros. And this is huge because we're going from agricultural to industrial. Puerto Rico's been taken over. People are going into poverty. And now, Rafael Hernandez starts singing about that. He sings about that. He writes about that pain. He writes about that displacement. So now he's writing music that's not for the upper classes. He's writing music that reflects these sirens behind me. He's writing music about the cold in the streets. He's writing music about the gangs, the language. He's writing, then Pedro Flores comes, another composer. So they have these trios. One of the singers was Dominican. So because he was Dominican, Rafael Hernandez's band would go from the plena music, the jibaro music, guaracha music. You have to remember that all this music blended. It wasn't a separation like we see today, like TV dinners. It blended, especially because Cuba and Puerto Rico were sister islands. And because of the marching bands, they played each other's music all the time. So, and then by 1920, Cuba gets the first radio station. And then as the music is developing, New York, the US, right, we go into prohibition. So the rum runners go to Cuba. And now there's radio in Cuba. And they start doing speakeasies in Cuba. So, but we got here now. Rafael Hernandez comes back, and by 1927, he opens up the first Spanish-American, he called it Spanish-American record shop on 114th Street and Madison. And he's selling piano rolls. And he's selling Victrolas. And now producers come to the store and they're looking for musicians. And by 1928-29, Rafael Hernandez and his trio, there are all these restaurants in San Juan Hill. Now in San Juan Hill, by 1918, was very ritzy, attracting a very ritzy Spanish crowd and Latin American crowd. And they had Masons, they had people like El Club Hispanoamericano, La Liga Masónica La Fraternidad, a Mason, Peruvian Social and Sporting Club, El Centro Social Venezolano, the Puerto Rican Brotherhood, La Unión Beneficia Española, a lot of Española, a lot of flamenco, there was still a lot of that, a women's auxiliary, and many baseball teams, baseball leagues, Puerto Ricans and Cubans. Again, there was a fraternity. And back then you needed musicians for everything, because even funeral parlors, that was a new thing. So people would have wakes in their house. And then after the wake, they have a procession to go to the pier, because many times the body would go back to Cuba or Puerto Rico. So all this was going on in New York City. And by the 30s, you have then the big Cuban song, El Manicero. El Manicero hits big. As I said, now Cuba had a radio station. Manicero becomes a huge hit. Not only that, there is a movie that is done called Cuban Song, and the anthem from that movie is El Manicero. They make cartoons, they make Follow the Bouncing Ball, they translate it horribly, but it is attractive to the white American crowd. Now back before Rafael Hernandez came, in the early 20s, there was a big band Cuban leader, Vicente Ziegler. But he had monthly shows. He would rent out the McAlpine Hotel, the Waldorf Astoria. But again, they wanted to attract a white crowd. So they had code words on the ads that would say, solamente para gallegos, gallegos only, like Spanish only. That was the code word for white.
Yeah.
Okay, so when Rafael Hernandez hits and he comes back with his trio, he is the rebel. He goes against all that classical music. And he starts with the music of the Jibaros. And he makes this a hit within the community. The community loves it. The community applauds it. He makes these hits. Pedro Flores comes, El Canario comes. Now the 30s are happening. The Cuban music is a hit. And there's a lot of things going on in Cuba because of prohibition. So Cuba becomes the first place where what happens in Cuba stays in Cuba. But here in New York, we have the guys, and there's all these restaurants now in San Juan Hill, especially one called Casa de Galicia. It's a banquet hall. And really, Rafael Hernandez and his trio, they play a lot in these restaurants. Restaurant La Rumba, I have a whole list here I can give you. But these restaurants, they were really serving the Spanish food, but now they're seeing that this Puerto Rican music, which is a combination of plena, guaracha, they were doing the Cuban tunes also, that it's lively and it makes people happy and nostalgic. So they start incorporating it. And San Juan Hill is building up. There's hotels there now, restaurants, entertaining people. By the 1925, La Prensa calls that, they have guest houses, and they say, come to El Barrio Hispano de Nueva York, San Juan Hill. And that's like in the Spanish paper, La Prensa. Back then, there were 5 papers for the Spanish community, and they were all bilingual, starting in 1901. So this shows you the kind of community that was already here. And like Lauren said, by the time the 30s is developing all this mixed music, and they're looking at the Cuban music, and then FDR does the good neighbor policy in 1933, and then even though he does a good neighbor policy, in Harlem there's the race riots. And what was going on in San Juan Hill also, there was this community of still Irish and Italian. Now, a lot of the Italians were in Harlem because of the big construction of the tunnels, the 17 tunnels that run through East Harlem and Central Park, where they first used eminent domain to get rid of Seneca Village. And I'm sure some of them went to San Juan Hill. And back then, if you were not Puerto Rican, because they put citizenship on us, we didn't ask for it, but they gave it to us in 1917. But back then, if you were Cuban or you were from the Caribbean and you wanted to vote, you could own property and they would let you vote. So owning property was important. So in East Harlem, in San Juan Hill, they were establishing that. But the music was growing and it was mixing. And by the 40s, and now in the 30s, you're having this explosion. There's Victrolas, now there's records, now there's record companies. You got Tin Pan Alley, you've got all these clubs coming up, right? And there's all kinds of acts. Everyone had like a vaudeville act, there were flamenco dancers, all of this, people with guitars singing from the mesma of the Gallego, of the Spanish cantors, to the Jibaro cry of Alelolai, Alelolai. But the 40s hits, and the 40s is a boom. Now you have all these clubs in New York, and there's a lot of them that are right coming out of San Juan Hill. And there are all these dances in these clubs. And now you have the Copacabana, the Chateau Madrid, the Palladium. These are all clubs that are surrounding San Juan Hill. And now you have Miguelito Valdez. You have Battle of the Bands, bebop and mambo. All right, this is all. And now what you have also in the 40s, Machito and the Afro-Cubans. So now you have Mario Bauza. Now Mario Bauza is interesting because he came here from Cuba. He was classically trained also. And he came here to make his way. He wanted to be like one of the black guys from Harlem. I interviewed him, and this is what he told me. And he wanted to do his own version of jazz with Latin music. And he did. But when he came here and when I interviewed him, what he found so interesting was that the younger Puerto Rican musicians who didn't know, when I interviewed him, it was already in 1981. And he kept saying that there was no excuse for these younger Puerto Rican musicians that did not know their music, didn't know plena, didn't know aguinaldo, didn't know any of this, but how they all wanted to play Cuban music. And he said, there's no excuse for not knowing your music. And he said, how can you create music if you don't have that foundation to create from? And he was absolutely right about that. And what the other thing he said was, when he got here to New York, the people that extended the hand to him was Rafael Hernandez, was Pedro Flores, was Canario. He played with them. They were already doing jazz. And then you had Agosto Cohen, who was an Afro-Puerto Rican Jew, who started an incubator band in the mid-30s alongside Rafael Hernandez. And there he had Alberto Socajas from Cuba, also lived in San Juan Hill. And he puts down the first jazz solo on a recording. And Cohen's orchestra, they went from orchestrated plenas to guarachas, all of this with jazz. You had Juan Tisol that was discovered by Duke Ellington, playing trombone, and he wrote Caravan. I always say Carnaval. Caravan! And so all of this is happening in the 30s, and then by the end of the 30s, Disney comes out with Three Caballeros. So the cartoons are talking about how they want to speak Spanish and be Spanish, right? And
Good neighbor policy.
Right, and then, yeah, the good neighbor policy. And then you had Hollywood. You had people like George Raff doing the dancer, the Rumba dancer. Then it was Rumba. But the Rumba in New York was like a foxtrot. And after World War II, I gotta tell you, the Jews, they loved the Rumba. They embraced it at their own. And Machito, I mean, I know Mario Bowser would tell me, Chocolate would tell me, every summer they were at the Concord. They were there, right? You remember, ladies?
Dirty
They
dancing.
were there, and they were supporting all this music. And the Jews they felt the music. I don't know if they felt that pain of displacement, whether it was the minor chords, whether it was the sound of melisma and the music, but they had the Catskills, because in America they didn't want the Jews. So they had to build their own place, and we like that. And they had so much employment for these big bands. So we're in the 40s now. The 40s, there's an explosion of all these clubs on television. You have I Love Lucy coming up, right? You have the Stork Club, and you have Noro Morales, a pianist from Puerto Rico who was classical, but then became very modern, because in Cuba in the 40s, Noro Morales was changing the music. That affected the musicians here. So bebop, by 48, when Chano Pozo went with Dizzy Gillespie, after that, Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie, every jazz band in New York City had a conga. They didn't have congas before. After that, they included congas. And that was huge, because Dizzy Gillespie knew what was missing. He knew the conga called him. He knew that in the US they took the drum from African Americans. And Arsenio knew it, which is why he brought the conga back. It was outlawed. Arsenio Rodriguez. He brought it back. So between all the rum joints, the speakeasies, the radio in Cuba, Arsenio changing the music, that affected everything here. And this music blew up. And as it's blowing up, that's when Robert Moses starts tearing up East Harlem.
That Robert.
East Harlem. East Harlem was being socialized. East Harlem was more of a worker's place. East Harlem, you had people like Jesus Colon, who was a writer, who worked for the workers' paper. And then you had the Italian Vito Marcantonio, who was a lawyer, who by the 30s and 40s, when Albizu Campos had the first successful workers' strike in Puerto Rico and was arrested, he went to Puerto Rico and defended him. when none of the leadership there, they all turned their back on him. So he had a very tight community. He had political people on every block. And then LaGuardia came in with Robert Moses. This has got to stop. And while America's doing a conga line to our music, Robert Moses is tearing up the blocks like he's in a war. 50 blocks were torn up. All these projects came up, which was very anonymous, made it very easy for crime to hide, took away that community feeling. And then he set his sights on San Juan Hill.
Okay, that was this is a rare opportunity now. So it's great that you put a lot of this.
Coffee.
See, eso. So it's great that you put all that stuff into context and the evolution of the music. But Elena, we had talked before about you focusing a little bit on the Harlem Hellfighters and James Reese Europe stories, and any other thing you want to add in reaction. And actually, as we go forward, you guys should feel free to just jump in and talk to each other on this.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I do want to say thank you to Anna and Eleni and the folks from Lincoln Center for inviting me and all of us on this project, the writing of the essays and this panel, so thank you. I tend to talk very fast, and I also had coffee in the green room, so I might be going very fast, so yell at me if you need me to slow down. So I just want to backtrack a little bit about what Aurora was talking about. James Reese Europe, like we're here in San Juan Hill, we're talking about, what's the connection between San Juan Hill and Puerto Rican. So really that connection is James Reese Europe. And why did James Reese Europe have Puerto Ricans in what we now call the 369th Regiment? So James Reese Europe, as Aurora talked a little bit about, he's such an important person. He died right after World War I, killed by the drummer in his band. But
watch out for those drums.
Such an important person. I suggest you really need to read up on him. He's probably the grandfather of the Harlem Renaissance, but unfortunately died so early and so young. Really never got to contribute more. But he has a connection here, as part of the Black creative musicians and artists in this neighborhood. The Marshall House on 53rd Street was a place where the creatives, musicians and artists would hang out. James Reese Europe, as a trained musician, started the Clef Club, which was a kind of a union and booking agency because a lot of the black musicians couldn't get into other gigs. So he started that was right across the street from the Marshall House. So he really had a presence here in the San Juan Hill area. World War II starts, and he is asked by Colonel Hayward. Colonel Hayward is the leader of the 15th Regiment of the New York National Guard, which is now we know it's the 369th, but they were the 15th Regiment of the New York National Guard. He's asked to be the band leader. And at that time, he was asked to be the band leader. He actually did not want to lead a marching band. He wasn't really into brassy, loud instruments. He was into strings. That Carnegie Hall concert that Aurora mentioned, he had tons of string instruments. That was really more his thing. But the whole thing about joining the regiment and being part of this military band was it was almost used as a recruiting instrument. A lot of the military bands at that time were used as ways to recruit people into the army. And so to have a really good band, Colonel Hayward wanted to have a really good band. And of course, James Reese Europe, having been on the scene for a long time in New York City, he was the director of the house band for the Castles, Irene and Vernon Castle, other two important people who also gave James Reese Europe his sort of introduction into Latin music. They sort of popularized tango, made tango and machixe, the Brazilian machixe, popular in the United States. Very cleaned up version of it, but they made that popular, and he was their band leader. So he sort of had his foot into some Latin music already. So he's, he's asked to be the director of this military band. He has great musicians in it, but he does notice that the clarinet section is weak. The clarinet section is a little weak. He can't find good clarinet players that he needs. And the clarinet in bands like this, in large bands like this, the military band is normally 28 musicians. He's allowed, because of his reputation, his popularity, he's allowed to get 40 musicians for the military band. And the clarinets, also in a military band, they take the place of the strings. So that's why he wanted to make sure he had a really good string session. So so now we're like, okay, where's the Puerto Rican connection? Why is the Puerto Rican connection? And I must say, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. back. You know, when I first learned about the 369th and that there was, you know, 1/3 of the military band were Afro-Puerto Ricans, I was like, why did no one ever tell me this? Why did I never learn this anywhere? If you read most history books about the 369th, not mentioned, or they're footnote. Puerto Ricans are footnote like we are in most history books. And also Ken Burns, you know, it's low-hanging fruit. Ken Burns, 18 hours of jazz documentary, and only like 6 minutes on Latin jazz, and in the section with the Harlem Hellfighters, not one mention, not even a mention that James G. Sharp went to Puerto Rico. So the history is you know, is not there. So, so why does he go to Puerto Rico? Well, in the Clef Club, in his band in the Clef Club and for the Castles, James G. Sharp had Rafael Escudero, who was a tuba player from Puerto Rico. So Rafael already had known of the quality of Puerto Rican musicians. He had played with some in the Castles band and the Clef Club orchestra, so he knew about some of the great, you know, talent that was from
The
there.
military bands.
Yep, the military bands. And also, he had a connection with Manuel Tisol. Manuel Tisol, who was the uncle of Juan Tisol. Aurora mentioned him earlier. Juan Tisol was the valve trombone player for Duke Ellington. Of course, the composer of Caravan and other jazz standards, also Puerto Rican. Manuel Tisol, his uncle, led some different orchestras and the bandas municipales, the municipal bands in Puerto Rico, in San Juan, which Rafael Hernandez was a part of. So
And they were family. I mean, these were family, these marching bands, because it was a way of getting out of slavery.
yeah, so Rafael was on the Manuel Tisol and James G. Sharp were both on the Victor Talking. What is it? Victor Talking Record?
Talking Record Company.
Talking Record. They were both on that label, so they would have known each other. Manuel Tisol also organized concerts of Puerto Rican musicians here in New York, so they would have known each other through back and forth. So James G. Sharp goes down to Puerto Rico for 3 days and recruits 18 musicians. One of them, Rafael Hernandez, his brother, Jesus Hernandez, Rafael Duchesne, as you know, were mentioned from another family of musicians. Duchesnes are really famous musical family in Puerto Rico in bandas municipales up till El Gran Combo. So you know their musicianship spans generations. So he brings these musicians back, and the thing is too, why Puerto Rico? Again, a couple reasons. Puerto Rico, like all over Latin America, has this tradition of bandas municipales, these municipal bands. In the 1890s, early 1900s, what's the only form of recreation people have? The band that plays in the plaza, you know, the central plaza in the town. Every little town has a municipal band, and they perform the, you know, military and popular music, you know, and a lot of the guys who were part of these bands were veterans usually, and they played, you know, military music. So they were also highly trained. Unlike the United States, where Jim Crow laws kept a lot of black musicians probably back from playing a lot of different places, in Latin America, being a musician was one way for musicians of color to make their way up and to get prestigious jobs. So it was really important that we had that tradition that really opened up to a really highly skilled talent of musicians. And James G. Sharp, people told him, go to Puerto Rico because, you know, you first of all, the Army segregated in World War I. The Army still segregated. So you can only have black musicians. So you can find Afro-Puerto Rican musicians, and they're highly trained, and they can sight read, and you just get them, and you can just bring them right back. The one thing I will point out, though, a lot of times it is said that one of the reasons he went down there, too, is because once World War I was declared in April 1918, the United States declared that they were going to enter war in April 1918, and all of a sudden citizenship is passed through really quickly on the island. It's not because they needed bodies to be soldiers. That's sort of like the thing that everyone thinks. It's, we needed to build, you know, get bodies of, you know, Puerto Rican bodies into the army to fight. Puerto Ricans were already allowed to be drafted or be conscripted after the Gonzales versus United States 1904 law, so they were already able to be drafted. And at that time, the United States was still it was a burgeoning empire. Unlike now, we didn't have a big army, so they weren't ready for this. So at the time when the United States needed people in the military, 1/5 of the United States Army at that time was immigrants. There were so many immigrants in the army that the war division of the government had to find a new division, the foreign language speaking division, because there were just so many people speaking different languages, immigrants, they didn't have, if you joined the army and fought in World War I, you didn't have to wait a 5-year wait period to get your citizenship. You could automatically become a citizen. So it's not like they needed Puerto Ricans to be in the army like our bodies. they were able to, because of these, the immigration laws that they changed. But what happened is that it had a geopolitical concern. Puerto Rico, being under the aegis of the United States, had a really geopolitical thing. It was to make sure that the Panama Canal was protected, and also to make sure that there were a lot of rumblings of independence movements on the island, and they wanted to sort of tamp that down because they didn't need to have a colony that was like erupting in rebellion while they were fighting a war. So they wanted to sort of like keep everything calm and tranquil there during this war. So that's really why all that stuff sort of happened in 1917, sort of like came all together at that time. Anyway, James G. Syrups brings back these musicians to Harlem and to take part in the regimental band. Noble Sissle, many remember later on after the war, becomes a major musician and composer on Broadway, and he's sort of given the task of taking care of all the Puerto Rican musicians. You remember they come in, they don't speak English. Noble Sissle didn't speak Spanish, so he had a hard job. You can read his memoirs. They're free. You can actually go on the Library of Congress website and read his whole memoirs, and he talks about that, how very hard it was. But he was sort of given that task. And they become part of the band. And they go to France to fight in the war in World War I. And again, as I mentioned, so segregated army, they're not allowed to fight they're not allowed to fight alongside of white regiments. So usually black regiments are given the task of like digging ditches and doing labor tasks. And but the French needed some help. So General Pershing, who was the head of the army at the time, detached the 15th New York National Guard Regiment from the Army, from the United States Army, and attached it to the 369th French Army. So that's why they're known as the 369th now. They were actually a National Guard regiment. So all the musicians who were part of that, like Raphael, musicians at the time don't usually fight. Musicians aren't like fighting on the line. The band musicians are usually part of the ambulance corps. But if you read Ruth Glasser, her books talks about how Raphael Hernandez was on the front lines a lot of times retrieving bodies, so it was still a very dangerous job. But their job as musicians in the band was to wake up, at dawn, roll call, reveille to the band when they got back, make sure when they got back from marching and different things that they were in good spirits. And Pershing did allow them to tour all around France. So they really introduced the European continent to this music that wasn't really jazz yet. It wasn't jazz music meets improvisation, which it didn't really have, but it had all these sort of ragtime elements. So they were sort of like a proto-jazz that they introduced to the English and French audiences over there. And then when they come back, they record on the Pathé label. For 4 sessions, and some of those recordings are still around. You can hear them. The musician sheets are not available, but people think that probably Raphael and his brother were probably the musicians on there. Raphael played the trombone in that band. So the 369th was a really important way for the Afro-Puerto Ricans to gain access here, and also they became part of the music. They became part of the music scene once they were here, the jazz world. Raphael Hernandez played with Charles Lucky Roberts, who was a stride pianist, who was also a member of the 369th Regiment. So after the war, he plays with some like jazz musicians.
And they know about the black theaters. I mean, one of the things Mario told me, they opened the doors for him. They knew where to go. And then he took it from there and hit in the 40s with Machito and the Afro-Cubans.
Yeah. So that's really how Raphael starts his career with this. And then one thing I want to also just point out is that since we're talking about this larger community, James G. Syrup is so important. I think everyone, again, after this, go out and buy the books about him. He's such an important figure in musical history. But, he's famous as in the ragtime classical music world. So he's known throughout the United States. Raphael Hernandez is known, he wrote songs for people in Chile, in Dominican Republic, all over. He's known from the tip of South America all through up to the top of North America. He's known throughout the entire New World because, Latino audiences everywhere love his songs, whether they were listening to Lamento Borincano, which he wrote about the Depression, or Cachita, because they're Cuban and they love that song that he wrote for their island.
And I found out that one of his tunes is rings from the Big London Bell.
Oh, really?
Yes, Raphael Hernandez.
Cumbanchero. How many go to any high school football game? Those marching bands play Cumbanchero, and that's Raphael Hernandez. You hear him everywhere. And I remember going to a talk one time, and this scholar was like showing the legacy of the 369th, and he showed some of the, like Burt Williams, who was a vaudeville actor. He showed the videos of them in different things, but he didn't have anything of Rafael Hernandez. And I was like, well, you could go back and go to some of the Mexican movies. You could find, footage of Rafael Hernandez. He was like, I'm not interested. He just wasn't interested, but the Rafael should probably be even more remembered than James Reese Europe because he had larger audience in that, where he reached much more of an audience. And again, our story is just not told and it's not remembered. So I think is the important legacy of that story.
And you're absolutely right. I think Rafael Hernandez has been underrated, and he's not only such an important figure, because like I said before, when everyone was doing Spanish classical and had all tango and we're Spanish, he said, no, we're Afro-Boricua. This is our culture. Wepa, let's go.
Let's not forget Victoria, too.
And when Victoria, well, of course, she was the one that was running the stores, and then had the store in the Bronx that now Mikey Amadeo,
right.
and that before that Al Santiago had.
Right.
And if we're going to talk about salsa, and we're going to go into the 50s, and all these clubs were around,
yeah.
And then, by the 50s, well, what we didn't mention in the 40s, which was really big for the rise of Latin music, there was the American Federation of Musicians strike. And so when that strike happened, BMI was a small company, but they had Peer International, and they started giving the radio stations free Latin music. And then when Perez Prado became, is it on?
Yes.
Okay. So when Perez Prado came to California and hit big with mambo in the 50s, then you had the rise of Tito Puente, then you had the rise of Tito Rodriguez.
The Mambo Kings.
The Mambo Kings.
Machito.
Then, and Machito, and Mario Bauza lived in 72nd Street. And when he got married, he left the apartment to Graciela, and he moved further uptown, but Graciela was in that apartment on 72nd Street until the day she died. And that was 2002, 2003?
Something like that.
Yeah, and she was there all that time. And basically there was a thing of being there because it was like to better yourself. And to better yourself,
Uptown.
you also uptown, like in San Juan Hill.
Right.
And you had to speak with the brothers in English.
Yeah.
And so Arsenio came and lived here, and he immortalized the
Right.
place when he did Fuego en la 23.
We would know, yeah.
Yes, and then of
But
course.
that's a Parada 23.
No. See, you got it
23rd
wrong
Street.
too.
What
No.
was it, 23rd Street?
If you hear the original song, go on YouTube, Arsenio Rodriguez,
Okay.
right? Fuego en la 23. At the beginning, his sonero, his singer, says in English, because he's talking about he had a dream, he's in a furnished room, and there's a fire. And he says the address, right at the beginning, he says, en la 23, West,
West 76.
West 65th.
65th.
En la 23, the West 65th. And he goes on. Now, 20 years later,
Yes.
Sonora Ponceña
Right.
redid the tune, but they were never in New York. So they misrepresented it and said 23 de la 110 and made it 110th Street instead of 65th Street. But Arsenio immortalizes San Juan Hill in the 50s.
Yeah.
Now you have the St. Nicholas Arena.
Right.
Now you have the Lincoln Square.
Yeah.
And they were ice skating rinks, but now they're having baile, they're having dances, they're having Latin music. By the end of the 40s, right, there's another American Federation of Musicians strike. So now you got more Latin music. Now you got more clubs coming up, right? Now it's the 50s. And by the 60s, in the 50s, you got Mongo Santa Maria comes up.
Yeah.
And Mongo brings,
From Cuba.
right, Mongo who brings tuned congas. And when he brings tuned congas, that opens a whole new world for all the percussionists here. Not only the Puerto Ricans, but the Jewish guys who told me that people up in the Catskills, people like Julito Collazo, these people, these great drummers that were coming with Machito and the Afro-Cubans and these other groups, were teaching them. They'd go to Central Park, they'd teach them. These were the best masters. You can't get more authentic than that. I don't care what they say today. These were the guys.
Yes.
They taught them, they went to Central Park and played, and then by the 60s, while everybody, all the young kids were doing the twist,
Boogaloo.
No, in the 60s, when all the young
Chubby
kids
Checker.
were doing the twist, we were doing the pachanga. Everyone was doing the pachanga, you know. And charanga was big. And now you have Al Santiago, now you have the Alegre All-Stars, now you have the second generation of Latinos that are in the school, now you have airplanes,
Right.
now you have a second wave of Puerto Ricans, and they're involved with doo-wop, they're involved with jazz, they're involved with rock. And we are involved in protesting what's going on in the community. But what do? We don't reject our parents' music. We
Right.
felt their pain. We
Well,
felt
there's a
their
little
pain of
ambivalence.
displacement.
Yeah.
We embraced it, we made it our own,
Yeah.
and then, because it had so many different rhythms, you know, the Cuban rhythms, the Dominican rhythms, the Puerto Rican rhythms,
We haven't talked
put
about-
it all under the
Yeah.
hubris of salsa,
Right, well, yes.
just to make it
Well, or
commercial.
the record company did.
Well, the record companies
Yeah.
did it, but
Yeah.
it was a way of not explaining everything. And again, there was always a great affinity with
Yeah.
Cubans and Puerto Ricans. Now in the 40s, there started tensions because Puerto Ricans were citizens and Cubans had to go through changes.
But they had a very easy path to citizenship.
Yeah, they did, but there was little tension, but the biggest tensions came through politics.
Yeah.
After the embargo, that's when you had
Right.
the biggest politics that Cuban music this and everything got politicized. Before that, it was, we all played the same music because they were in the marching bands. Like Arsenio said, it was a black thing.
It's always been a black thing, actually. So yeah, well, the point too really is the transnationalism of everything and how all of these different groups came together. And, you know, Rafael Hernandez wrote Lamento Borincano in Harlem, and everybody thought of it as a song about Puerto Rico. And that great story about Fuego en la 23 is another example of, yeah. Okay, so now we have reached the question and answer portion of our program. And I'm excited because I know that, please don't jump up too quickly. I know that there are many of you here, and don't forget to ask Lauren a question because she hasn't spoken for like 50 minutes. Anybody out there, you know, I can start the question and answer session. Okay, aquí mismo tenemos una persona que quiere hablar. Por favor, Robert. Thank you.
Yes, my question, but first I want to make a statement, if you don't mind. I grew up in Chelsea. I was born in 1940, and I remember around 1951, 52, in the hot summer when I had no air conditioning and I had my windows open, I couldn't sleep because of all the music at 2 o'clock in the morning on the stoops of Chelsea. And it was wonderful in retrospect. in retrospect. Please forgive me. And I was a dancer also, a dancer and a social dancer, so I learned how to mambo my ass off.
Good, you didn't call the cops, right? That wasn't you.
No. And I truly embrace, and I live on 65th Street, 34 West 65th Street.
So it was hot then.
Yes.
It was hot then.
Yes. Well, I wasn't there then. But my question is, what happened to the Puerto Ricans when we tore down all the buildings? You didn't say that. You didn't tell us. Because 2 weeks ago we heard what happened to the blacks that lived, the African Americans that lived in this neighborhood. So what I would like to know is, where did they go? Thank you.
It's not actually, it's not that well known. I mean, you know, some went back to East Harlem. I mean, the money that people were given for relocation was like nothing. And the rents here, from what I've read, were like the cost per room was, you know, so much lower than East Harlem at that time. I mean, there were neighborhoods in Brooklyn, I mean, some parts of the Bronx that people could go to. And then there was also, there was so much racism in the housing market. I mean, this affected African Americans and Puerto Ricans similarly. The new Puerto Rican migrants were at the greatest disadvantage because they were the ones who were probably working the lowest wage, least secure jobs in the, in the mid-50s. This is before deindustrialization started really reducing the number of decent factory jobs. That was in the early to mid-60s that started. But the recent migrants, the people who had arrived in the neighborhood starting in the early 50s were the ones who were most vulnerable. A lot of them, wound up kind of combining with other family members. It was about, I'm actually not sure how many, I mean, the numbers of people and the numbers of Puerto Ricans specifically is kind of, contested. Robert Moses said it was under 6,000 families that were being displaced. The Migration Division and the lawyer, Harris Present, who represented a group of tenants in a case against the city, saying that they had illegally sold land to Fordham, saying that was a violation of the laws of separation of church and state. He lost multiple lawsuits on that claim.
But he didn't sell it to them, he gave it away to them.
What, Robert Moses?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was very undervalued.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that was the most viable legal argument that Harris Present, who was a lawyer who had worked with the Puerto Rican community for 15 years by that point. That was the argument he made. So Present's estimate of the number of displaced was over 7,000 families. And so the part of the answer to your question is that there was not a lot of interest in what people were doing. Or keeping track. I mean, there were some studies, right the same year that the plans for building Lincoln Center were announced in 1955. New York was in the midst, I mean, there was a kind of ongoing post-war housing crisis across the country, but New York, it was protracted, it was much more intense here because of the, various limitations on affordable housing already and racism. And this housing advocate named Charles Abrams had published an article in 1955 and said that New York had worse housing conditions than he'd traveled all over the world. I mean, this is possibly a little bit of hyperbole, but a lot of truth to it too. And that New York had worse conditions than he had seen in his worldwide tour. And it was the Puerto Ricans who were the hardest hit by the housing problems, and at the same time there was this committee, what was the name of it, the Committee for Better Housing, that was kind of connected to Robert Moses' plans for the city, had produced a study of the housing issues in the city, and they said the study concluded, same year, 1955, if only the Puerto Ricans wouldn't accept such poor conditions, then they wouldn't be suffering so much from these problems.
Let them feed their children.
So, this was the moment when this is all announced. And at the same time, I'm just going to riff a little bit on this period, just to give a little more context. The labor movement, Puerto Ricans had become, dating back to the 1920s, the early, or the middle migration of the three phases that I talked about, there was a lot of labor activism among Puerto Ricans. Jesus Colon, I think Aurora mentioned him, was an early leader, Bernardo Vega, and they were part of a kind of heterogeneous labor movement. In the 50s, there was a resurgence of labor activism and specifically objections to, even in the more progressive unions like the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had a kind of more progressive leadership. There was Puerto Ricans were saying that, you know, we're not able to achieve any leadership positions here. This is something that that needs to be addressed, and they were a lot of this kind of debate was happening alongside African Americans too. And then there was a period of increased strike activity, 1956 to 58. So there's all this kind of ferment in the city, in these political and kind of social spheres. And then there's also, you know, I mean, there had been this long-standing effort since the 1920s for Puerto Ricans to have political representation. I mean, that started in East Harlem, also in Brooklyn, and in the mid-1950s, there was a little bit of traction. I mean, the first candidate, I mean, there had been a couple of, or two representatives in the state assembly by that point.
You had Oscar Rivera too?
Yep, Rivera and Felipe and Torres.
Yes.
And then a magistrate judge was appointed. Mayor Wagner was sort of slightly responsive to some of the pressure that he was getting, that Puerto Ricans were being excluded. There was all this, you know, they were not included in these housing committees, and sort of being
Ignored.
yeah, just not participating in I mean, not being invited to participate in all these issues that were happening at the civic level. So there was a bunch of change related to that. And then 1957 was when West Side Story was first produced on Broadway. That was the same. I think the opening night of West Side Story happened within a couple of weeks of the first phase of the lawsuit to defend the tenants in Lincoln Square,
Yeah.
Which was significant, and this was, you know, covered
Wow.
very closely in El Diario, because it was so significant for the Puerto Rican families in particular. So that was like, it was all this just sort of like compressed, like struggle to not be invisible, to have city officials actually pay attention to what this very significant part of the population, significant part of the labor force was struggling with. And this was also the same time when it was called at first the Hispanic Day Parade. What became the Puerto Rican Day Parade was the first year that happened was 1956. And then, you know, just it was an intense several years.
Wasn't statehood also an issue?
I'm sorry?
Wasn't statehood also an issue with the Truman and
Well, I mean,
The thing with Truman was.
No, it was the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
There was a pushback against the shift to the Commonwealth. That was 1952, and that, I mean, you know, the nationalists were like mounted a campaign against perfumed colonialism, and yeah, so that, I mean, that was sort of in the background, and certainly the more politicized members of the community, especially the ones who had been around for decades, were heavily involved in that also. So, all right, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Los Perfumados, right?
While you had the Young
let's
Lords
continue.
on the west side, you had, on the east side, you had coming down the west side.
Other housing activists.
Mhm.
The next question. Right over here.
So you mentioned Victoria and I think a Graciela. I don't know who they are, so if you could clarify who they are, and then it just makes me think a bit more about where women are in the story and this part of history.
Well, women, as usual, we become the administrators. So Rafael Hernandez's sister was a very accomplished pianist in her own right. And when they bought the store in 1927, she ran the store. And she was the administrator. She gave piano lessons in the back. But because there were producers coming, because, you know, there was this interest in these polyrhythms, she would help other artists broker deals with the record companies. And she was really good at it. She was so good. The other artists, if you read, Ruth Glasser has a great book called My Music is My Flag. And in it, she writes that the other musicians would call her La Judia, because she was so good in negotiating these deals. But, and then I spoke before about Socajas, Alberto Socajas, who was one of the first to have a jazz flute in I forget the name of the piece now, but it's, if you read my article, Dance of Displacement, it's in there. I think I even have a hyperlink, and you can hear it. But his sister was also a gifted violinist, never recognized. And then Graciela was Machito's sister. Graciela was Machito's stepsister, I think. And when Machito went into the army, Mario Bauza flew Graciela, who had been playing in the all-girl group in Cuba, Anacaona. Graciela played the bass, she played clave. So he brought Graciela to New York to sing with Machito and the Afro-Cubans. So, I mean, those are just those women. There were many other women. There were women that led some of the big symphony bands in New York. There were one or two of them that were band leaders. There was one, I think, called Orquesta Aurora. Of course, I remember it, I have my name. But they were women in their own right, but of course, they were never recognized, and there was so much to deal with in this new world. And as I said at the beginning, there were like 5 or 6 different newspapers, and one of them was a weekly called El Nuevo Mundo. And a lot of the times, I noticed in reading these old papers, they have consejos femeninos, feminine council, how women should act or dress, and they show like the roaring 20s dresses and all of that that's going on. But basically, the women, you know, if you're not from the upper classes, then you were just helping your husband work or with the children. And that's unfortunate, but that's throughout our history. You know, we are the slave of slaves still. So.
Remember, La Prensa had that column for years.
Right? Your mic.
Sorry, La Prensa had that column for many years, Para las Damas.
Yeah, para las damas.
Yeah,
Starting in
women's
the, starting in the
Times
early
too.
20s, I mean, I'm sure it was,
Yeah,
a
in the
comment,
Times
but
too, yeah.
Women's page.
It's very prescriptive,
Yes,
especially in the 1920s.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Let's not forget Julia de Burgos.
Oh, Julia de Burgos, oh yes, she came in the 30s, and she was part of that literary crowd that came. She was a communist. She had been a teacher in Puerto Rico. She came here, her poetry was phenomenal. She inspired Sylvia Plath. Many of you may know the poetry of Sylvia Plath. They made a movie about her because she went mad, but no one's heard of Julia de Burgos.
No.
And her poetry is just also amazing. She also went a little mad and became an alcoholic and was found dead on the street in front of Central Park on 106th Street.
Who was that?
And Julia de Burgos.
Really?
Julia de Burgos, yes. Yes. So this is what happens to some of our women, you know, so it's unfortunate, you know, it still happens today. Still happens today. We're still hearing it. We still got a ways to go, ladies. I mean, you know.
Keep up the good fight.
Yeah. The Taliban took women out of schools, and the U.S. Banned abortion. So, I mean, you know,
Okay.
what are we going to do? Anyway.
Fight.
Fight.
Fight,
And
fight,
the mambo
fight.
dancers too.
Fight, fight,
And
Who's
the
that
mambo
famous mambo dancer that
Which
she was like the queen of the mambo dancers?
the queen of the mambo
No
dancers.
matter what, I think I saw a documentary.
Your mic is enough. Your mic.
Millie Donay.
Okay,
really,
yeah.
that's what-
Oh, Millie Donay?
Yeah.
Oh, Millie Donay. I see, and she was Italian. But she was amazing.
Honorary.
Millie Donay was Italian, but she was with Cuban Pete,
All right,
who was
Cuban
actually
Pete,
Puerto
that's
Rican. Cuban Pete was Puerto Rican. But Desi Arnaz had that song, and he went with it.
Right. Hay otra pregunta más. One more or two. Aquí mismo. This man here.
Yes, hi, good evening. My name's Harry Masonet, also a musician, percussionist, and that's a lot to unpack up there. It's a hell of a lot. I was looking forward to this panel all week. There's a lot to unpack and say. As a musician, first off, and as Puerto Rican, I'm astounded at the fact that if we can, chronologically, we're speaking the late 1800s and everything that transpired going forward, musically, politically, you know, the entire gamut of what's been, you know, discussed so far. Where are we now, and why, like I believe Laura, or why are we now a footnote? You know, the Puerto Rican experience and everything that we've accomplished, you know, in the arts and politics, so on and so forth. Why is the Puerto Rican experience a footnote, especially in New York, of all places? There's no statues, there's no mention, there's no achievements, there's no awards, and I'm like beside myself. Yo estoy casi por explotar, you know, really, because there's no accomplishments, and then everybody else comes here and they've stolen everything that we've achieved. Musically, I mean, I'll put it right there. I'm not, you know, yo no tengo pelo en la lengua.
Let me say one quick thing, and then you're not done.
I'm not done. Give me a second. I'll be done because I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. I've had not with the panel itself, but I've talked to people extensively over the years, and I'm like, pero qué? What's going on? You know, and people just come from other países and they claim this, and you know, oh no, we're Latinos here. And we're this and we're that, and wait a minute. You know, let's not forget que vino Rafael Hernández, que vino, you know, tal y tal, Sócrates, you know, though Cuban, but, you know, so, you know, we're at a moment, I think we're at a precipice right now, the Puerto Rican, because we're not getting acknowledged for anything whatsoever. What do we do going forward? Because the Latin Grammy is a joke. I speak to musicians all the time, and they're like, don't even talk about the Latin Grammys. You know, because first of all, the reason why we have Latin Grammys is because Puerto Ricanos like Charlie Palmieri, Eddie Palmieri, and Larry Harlow, honorary Puerto Rican, Larry Harlow, and so on and so forth, were on that panel, met with Naris, and got us 2 categories in the Grammys. And from then on, it escalated, and we got the Latin Grammys. Now, they don't even mention, you know, salsa, Latin music, whatever you want to call it, or Rafael Hernández, or anyone else, you know, in our strata of music or accomplishment or anything. So, you know, I mean, what do we do going forward if, you know, and we become, you know, a footnote and non-existent? I would like to see some kind of, you know, personally, some kind of committee, or I spoke to someone in the mayor's office a while back, you know, about putting something together, you know, to also, you know, and take it to the schools. That's where you start, you know, with the young, you know, the youngsters, and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's my little, you know, soapbox over here. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the panel.
Thank you for that.
Lauren,
I don't have a diagnosis. I do have a comment about a kind of the goal that you're talking about, and I speak as a non-Puerto Rican who has written and researched a lot about Puerto Rican history in the United States. And my first book, which was about New York, I wrote with the inspiration that you can't understand the history of New York City in the 20th century without knowing the history of Puerto Ricans in New York. And I think, like, I'll speak from the perspective of the discipline of history and professional historians, but as we know lately, we do have some role to play in kind of our larger kind of consciousness as a nation, especially about the past and how we see ourselves. There's a sort of long period after historians stopped writing exclusively about white men, which was maybe by the 1950s, and professional historians began to concern themselves with other people, other groups, and there's this kind of like period of discovery history. I mean, there's so much, and this is what is kind of ongoing. That's what you're talking about, and that's what we've all been addressing is stories that should be better known, and they're not yet that well known. But in the sort of not too distant future, it's possible to imagine. Actually, Ed and I were just talking about a recent book by a poet named Joshua Bennett. It's a book about spoken word, kind of a history of spoken word. And I haven't read it yet, but I read several reviews, and I was intrigued by the book primarily because it was clear that the Puerto Rican poets and the history of Puerto Ricans in the spoken word movement were really significant, but it didn't, they were just included as part of this history. And I think that, that's the goal, is that you tell the history of a neighborhood or of a city or of certain issues in politics or a certain part of, poetry or the arts, and you include the people who were there and who affected the development of that thing. And that is something that requires ongoing, just increasing awareness. And so the essays that we all contributed to this website is part of that. And it's something that is a constant kind of process of communicating and pushing to broaden our narratives, like to understand ourselves as a society, as a nation, and not leave people out in those narratives.
I see it very clearly when it happened, especially with regards to the music, has to be the 1980s. That's when Reaganomics took music and art out of the public schools.
That's right.
We had music and art in public
That's
schools.
right.
Ever since public schools happened in the late 100 years, I mean, we had settlement houses, Henry Street settlement, Union settlement. And these people believed, and I believe, that you really educate a human being, not only reading and writing, but the arts, civics. How does the government work? They took all that out in the 80s, and it was done on purpose. They also changed the frequency of the music. You know, as a musician, how do you tune? 440, right? 440. Well, they changed the frequency. And what we have now, I mean, if you've ever read 1984, and you hear how they describe the music in that book, that's what we're hearing. People who have never heard poetry, they've never heard Rafael Hernandez, they've never heard Robert Frost, they've never heard Beethoven, Cole Porter, Glenn Miller, Tito Puente. This is what you're gonna have. You're gonna have music that sounds like roses are red, violets are blue, I smoke drank blunts, and I messed you up anyway.
And who are you?
Yeah, you know what I mean. So, and then we haven't told our stories. One of the things I know that Tito Puente told me, I have a page on Medium, I have an article there about meeting Tito Puente for the first time. And one of the things he liked about me, he said, you're controversial. You tell it as it is. He wasn't used to that. You know, and many people at that time, especially music journalists, got paid off. So you said whatever. And I was new, and I was trained, and I went to Columbia University, so I was on another plane. And Tito saw that. He liked that. And he said, we have to tell our stories. not to offend anyone, but one of the things he said, I'm tired of white people writing about this music. They don't know. He said, someone like you're from the hood. And he liked that. He said, you understand the music. He loved that I knew the Jibaro music, that I understood Rafael Hernandez. Yet, I came from a classical position. My parents were Jibaros. You know, I loved rock and jazz. Yeah. So, all of this combined to me is Latin music. What we have now is to make money, is to make corporate money. All of it is corporate money. And it's on a level that we didn't even know. They're talking about billions. And why do we have billionaires? I mean, it's bad enough millionaires. Why do we have billionaires? I mean, it's just, we haven't reconciled our technology with our humanity. And I think we've done that with the music also. We went from the agricultural age to the industrial age. And Rafael Hernandez was able to get in that middle, in that schism, and make that, hand it down to a generation like myself, hand it down to jazz people, and he's still not been recognized for that. And now what we have today is we're in the financial age. Listen to that, financial age. Okay, industrial age, I get it. Airplanes, trains, record player, music. But now we're in the financial age. So what are we going to sacrifice now? What you say is very important. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know we have to keep talking about it. We have to keep searching. And one of the things I'll tell you, even our young people, they don't know their history. I hear an iPod of some woman putting down Rafael Hernandez as colonialist? Yeah, because of Piel Canela. Listen to that. But they listen to Me Gusta la Chocha de Puerto Rico. You know, I don't understand this.
Bad Bunny reference.
I don't understand it. Someone explain it to me. I'm open-minded, but I gotta tell you, there's nothing like our music. Our music is something else. I miss it too, Papa. I miss it.
Elena has
just a couple points to make to your question. The Latin Grammys is a different animal, but the Grammys are horrible. The Grammys themselves are horrible. And a few years ago, that category is the Latin jazz category at the Grammys, which Larry Harlow, Eddie Palmieri, and them had a hand in making. Fought very hard to get the Latin jazz category. And then a few years ago, about 10 years ago, Neil Portnow, the director who's gladly kicked out, I think he was Me Too'd, he was just a jerk, he's been kicked out of the Grammys. He cut a bunch of categories, all ethnic categories, Cajun, world music, Native American music, Mexican ranchera. He cut a bunch of categories, and Latin jazz being one of them. Now, a lot of people got together and did protests, but in the end, it was a lawsuit by 4 people, 1 Puerto Rican and 3 Jews, who fought the Grammys and got the Latin jazz category reinstated. So it is, you can fight and, to get things on. But one thing I just want to say too is why are we a footnote? I think a lot of times I'll go back to I use Ken Burns as a good reference for this. I think if you watch every Ken Burns documentary, I like that. I think he's very good. I like his actually I do like his filmmaking,
Wonderful.
but his stories are always about black and white, and we're not a society of black and white, and so the Latino community is very complex. Afro-Latinos, I mean, how do you talk about Rafael Hernandez in the 369? They're Afro-Latinos, it's totally different. How do you talk about the Garifuna in today's world, a black Latino group who speak an indigenous language? I mean, it's very complex, and our society just isn't built to deal with complexities and nuance. And I don't want to say, I don't think we should be fighting Puerto Ricans against blacks. I think we all need to unite against this. But the society at large kind of pits everything and just sees everything in one way. And I think we have to start making sure we make the discussions about Afro-Latinos and all these different discussions, that it's a more complex discussion than what Ken Burns, who's backed by tons and tons of corporate money, bring to us all the time. So I just
And at the end of the day, that's right. Give it to Elena. But at the end of the day, Harry, Rafael Hernandez, he didn't need no Grammy. I remember when they were doing the Grammys, I was with Ismael Rivera. He was doing that iconic album, Esto Sí Es Lo Mío. I remember a reporter came in and said, Ismael, what do you think of the Grammys? And he looked at him and said, this was his words. A New Yorker, Puerto Rican New Yorker, right? Grammy, Hammy. Lo que es importante es vender disco. Okay, he said Grammy Hammy. What's most important is selling records. And that's what the Grammys does now. It's really like it measures how many records you bought. You know what? What I say, we don't need no Grammys. All right, it was good. We fought for it. We were in there, but we gotta keep doing our own thing like we have been doing. And we do it like no one else. You know why? Because we have that mixture and we have that energy inside us. And we still cling and hang on to the pain and the history of our ancestors. We are still talking here of 100 years ago when this music got here. And I think that's important. That's long-standing. And I know my grandchildren are still going to sing Preciosa. Mark Anthony did it. So that's right. They're still going to sing that and not this other stuff I hear. It's good. It's a flash. But we're going to still be spinning the same wheel because we don't go back and see our real history. You know, we don't have historians. We have people that have certain heroes and have certain information here and information there, but we haven't connected those dots, analyzed, dissected, compared. No one's done that. We have to start doing that. We have to tell our stories.
Okay, I think we've had a really profound and far-reaching and intelligent conversation about San Juan Hill and the Puerto Rican roots in New York, and so I'd like to thank our panel. And Aurora Flores.
Moderator, Ed Morales.
Yeah, I hope you check out my work in the New York Times. See you soon.
He's actually writing a book now, and where I have a podcast series with a young girl who's 17 and knows so much about the history of this music. It's called 100 Years of Latin Music in New York. It's on my YouTube page. You could look it up, and there's a lot of things coming, and we're still working to tell our stories.
Buenas noches.
Briefly, I have so many thank yous. I'll make it very brief. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, Ed, for moderating tonight. Thank you to our presenting partners, Center for Puerto Rican Studies, to all of the staff at Lincoln Center who helped make this evening possible, and definitely to our audience for your energy and for your insight. And this was a great question and answer session. And I just want to reiterate, there's if you want to learn more and keep exploring, our Legacies of San Juan Hill digital hub is at lincolncenter.org/San Juan Hill. We also have another conversation, the final one in this series, that focuses specifically on Latin jazz in 2 weeks on Tuesday, May 23rd. Yep. And stay around, we have some complimentary beverages in the back. The panelists are here if you have more questions, or maybe they'll keep talking to you. Nicole and James are going to play another set, and I hope you have a wonderful night, so thank you.
Thank you.